Garrett Sullivan's gelding stumbled through snow that rose past its chest. The wind cut like a knife, and the February dust turned everything to ash except for the trail of smoke rising in the distance. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed the exhausted horse forward. 3 hours he'd ridden through this hell, spurred on by a neighbor's frantic message delivered to his ranch that morning. "Your parents' home. Fire in the night. Come quick." The message had been sparse, saying nothing of survivors. Now, as he crested the final hill overlooking the small homestead where he'd grown up, his breath caught in his throat. Where the modest cabin should have stood, only blackened timbers remained, their skeletal frames reaching toward the gray sky like accusing fingers. Snow had already begun to cover the ruins, nature's shroud over human tragedy. "Ma!" Garrett's voice cracked as he dismounted, boots sinking deep into the snow. He stumbled forward, scanning the destruction for any sign of life or death. The barn still stood untouched, but the house was gone. Only the stone chimney remained upright, a lone sentinel over the ashes of the Sullivan home. He called again, desperation rising in his voice, the sound swallowed by the howling wind. 3 months. It had been 3 months since he had last visited, too consumed with land deals, cattle contracts, and expansion into Montana. He'd sent letters, money, but not his presence. "Sullivan?" Garrett spun around, hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. An old man stood there, lantern raised against the gathering darkness, his weathered face grim beneath a snow-covered hat. Jennings, Garrett recognized their nearest neighbor, a homesteader who'd settled in the valley the same year as his father. "My parents, they're alive." The old man's words sent relief flooding through Garrett's body, nearly buckling his knees. "Fire took hold 3 nights back. Middle of the night. Would have taken them too if not for the widow Winters." "Widow Winters?" Garrett repeated, the name vaguely familiar. "Sarah Winters. Lives up on Ridge Creek. Husband died couple years past." Jennings gestured toward the distant hills where a faint light glowed against the darkening sky. "Strange thing is, she wasn't just passing by like she claims. According to your ma, she'd been keeping an eye on your folks ever since that city man, fancy suit, banker type, came around making threats about selling their land." Garrett frowned. "What city man?" "Some fella named Blackwood. Works for a bank in town. Been pressuring smaller homesteaders to sell. Your pa refused him, and Sarah overheard the argument from the ridge while gathering herbs. Said she didn't like his tone, so she'd been checking on your parents every night since. She was approaching the house when she saw the flames, got your folks out just before the roof collapsed. They've been with her since." Garrett's heart sank into his boots. His parents, alive but homeless, dependent on a stranger's charity while he'd been hundreds of miles away, too busy with his empire to check on them. "Thank you," he said, already turning back to his horse. "I'll head there now." Jennings caught his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. "Sullivan," his voice had hardened, "your folks needed you 3 days ago. They needed you 3 months ago. That woman's been sharing what little she has while you've been building your kingdom." Shame burned hotter than any fire could. Garrett nodded once, unable to meet the old man's eyes, and mounted his horse. As he turned toward the distant light on the ridge, snowflakes began to fall once more, erasing his tracks almost as soon as they were made. The small cabin on Ridge Creek glowed like a lantern against the storm, smoke curling from its chimney into the darkening sky. Garrett approached slowly, the windows frost-rimmed but warm with light from within. He dismounted, tethered his horse beneath the crude lean-to beside the cabin, and moved to the window. Through the crystalline patterns of frost, he saw his mother seated at a rough-hewn table, her silver braid loose over one shoulder. She was laughing, actually laughing, while a woman in a faded calico dress ladled stew into wooden bowls. His father's bent shoulders hunched over his plate, but his gnarled hand rested on the woman's wrist as she passed. Sarah Winters. Garrett had heard of her now that he thought about it. A woman alone, husband dead 2 years back, kept to herself, struggled through winters on pride and grit, and now she was feeding his parents. The weight of his neglect hit him with crushing force. He'd built an empire, owned 3 sprawling ranches, had a bank account that could buy half of Cedar Valley. But this stranger, this woman with flour on her apron and patches on her sleeves, was doing what he should have done. An empty rocking chair sat by the fire as if waiting. Garrett's hand hovered over the door, his breath frosting in the air. Inside, his mother's laughter rang out again, warm and bright. He hadn't heard that sound since before Elizabeth died. He didn't knock. Not yet. The door swung open before he could decide. Cold air flooded the cabin. Sarah Winters stood in the doorway, wooden spoon in hand, her gray eyes sharp as flint. "Mr. Sullivan," she said flatly. Behind her, his mother gasped. "Garrett!" She rose from the table, joy and hurt warring on her face. His father didn't stand, didn't even turn around, just kept his eyes on his bowl. The silence stretched between them, decades of unspoken words filling the space. "You're late, Sullivan," Daniel finally said, his voice rough as gravel. "House burned down 3 days ago." In that moment, the old battlefield between father and son reopened. The surname instead of son, the coldness, the old resentment. This wasn't just about Garrett's absence these past 3 months, but the older wound from the war, when Garrett had donned Union blue against his father's wishes. He still remembered that spring day in 1862. The recruitment poster tacked to the general store wall, the way his father's face had hardened when Garrett announced his decision to enlist. "No son of mine fights for Lincoln's army," Daniel had thundered, slamming his fist on the table so hard the plates jumped. The same table now reduced to ashes. Daniel hadn't come to see him off at the station, hadn't read the letters Garrett sent from training camp. And when news came of Elizabeth's difficult pregnancy, Daniel had written just once, not to his son, but to Elizabeth herself. "Come home to people who'll care for you properly," the letter had said. "Your husband has made his choice." For 2 years after Garrett's return, his father had refused to call him by name, only Sullivan, as if speaking to a stranger. The wall between them had never fully come down, just weathered enough to let necessary words pass through. "Ma," Garrett said, stepping inside and pulling off his hat. Snow melted on the floorboards. "Pa." Sarah closed the door behind him and set another bowl on the table without a word. Her movements were tight, controlled. She didn't look at him. "Sit," his mother said softly, gesturing to the empty chair. Clara Sullivan had always been the bridge between her husband and son, spanning the chasm their stubborn pride had created. Garrett sat. The cabin was small, one room really, with a loft overhead, but it was warm, clean. A pot bubbled over the fire, and the smell of venison stew made his stomach clench with hunger he hadn't realized he felt. "I came as soon as I heard," he started. "I sent letters, but—" "We got them," his father interrupted, still not looking at him. "Paper don't fill a belly." Garrett flinched. Sarah ladled stew into his bowl and set it down with more force than necessary. "Eat," she said, not an invitation, a command. He picked up the spoon. The stew was good, better than anything his ranch cook made, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. "How long have they been here?" he asked, looking at Sarah. "Since the fire," she said curtly. "Found them huddled in your barn, half frozen. Brought them here. And you've been taking care of them." "Feeding them," she corrected. "Keeping them warm, that's all." Garrett reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. Coins clinked inside. "Let me pay you. It's the least." Sarah's eyes went cold. "The least would have been showing up, Mr. Sullivan." She turned her back on him. "This isn't a transaction. You can't buy decency." Silence fell like a hammer. His mother reached across the table and touched Sarah's hand in solidarity. His father still hadn't looked at him. Garrett set the pouch down slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. Sarah didn't turn around. "Sorry doesn't keep people warm." The wind howled outside. The fire crackled, and Garrett realized he was the outsider here, the stranger in his own parents' lives. The next morning, pale sunlight broke through the clouds. The snow had crusted overnight, hard enough to walk on. Garrett woke on the floor near the fire, his back stiff from the unaccustomed hardness. Sarah was already up, stoking the embers and setting a kettle to boil. His parents still slept in the loft above. "I need to check on my horse," Garrett said quietly, pulling on his coat. Sarah nodded without looking at him. Outside, the world was blindingly white. His gelding had weathered the night well enough in the lean-to, though it still looked exhausted from yesterday's desperate ride. As he filled a bucket with snow to melt for the animal, He noticed a small path leading away from the cabin, freshly broken through the snow. Curiosity pulled him along it. The path wound through a stand of pines and opened onto a small clearing. There, in the stillness of the winter morning, stood a small graveyard. One headstone stood alone, simple and weathered. Thomas Winters, 1850-1883. Sarah knelt before it, brushing snow from the grave with her bare hands. She hadn't heard his approach. Garrett stood 10 paces back, hat in hand, feeling like an intruder on private grief. "My husband," Sarah said without turning, somehow sensing his presence. "Fever took him 2 winters ago, left me the cabin, the debts, and his good name." She paused. "I lost everything, but I didn't bury myself with him." Her words hit Garrett like a fist to the chest. He thought of Elizabeth, his wife, the way she'd smiled when she told him she was pregnant. The way that smile had faded as labor went on too long, too hard. The midwife's grim face, the silence where a baby's cry should have been. He'd left the nursery intact for 6 months. Then he'd locked the door and thrown himself into work. Built ranches, bought land, hired men, anything to keep moving, keep building, keep avoiding the empty room with the empty cradle. He'd sent his parents money because it was easier than sitting with them, easier than facing their questions, easier than feeling anything at all. Sarah stood and faced him. "You think money fills the hole? It doesn't. Presence does." "I know," he said quietly. "Do you?" The wind shifted. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Sarah looked up at the sky. "Another storm's coming. You're staying whether you like it or not." She walked past him toward the cabin. "Might as well make yourself useful." Back inside, his mother had moved the empty rocking chair closer to the fire. She patted the worn seat. "Sit, son. Stay a while." Garrett sat. His father glanced at him for the first time. Didn't say anything, just nodded once and went back to whittling a piece of wood. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. 4 days snowed in. Garrett learned what it meant to be useful. His hands, soft from signing contracts and shaking hands with bankers, split and blistered from chopping wood. Sarah bandaged them without comment, her touch efficient and impersonal. He learned to milk the goat, badly at first until his father showed him the right grip. He hauled water from the creek, breaking through ice with an axe. He mended a broken chair leg, following his father's quiet instructions, and he learned to knead bread. Sarah stood beside him at the table, her hands working the dough with practiced ease. "Push with your palms, not your fingers. Like this." He tried. The dough stuck to his hands. "You're too gentle," she said. "It needs strength." He pressed harder. The dough began to come together. "Better," she said, almost a compliment. His mother hummed hymns by the fire. His father told old stories about the early days in Wyoming before the railroads, before the towns, when it was just land and sky and survival. Garrett listened, really listened, and something in his chest began to thaw. On the 3rd day, as Garrett split wood behind the cabin, he cut his hand deeply with the axe. Blood blossomed across the snow as he stumbled back toward the door. Sarah saw him coming and swept everything off the table in one fluid motion. "Sit," she commanded, pulling a worn leather case from beneath her bed. Inside lay a collection of medical instruments, neatly arranged and well-maintained. With practiced hands, she cleaned the wound, stitched it closed, and bandaged it tightly. "You have a doctor's touch," Garrett said, watching her work. She paused, just for a moment. "War teaches many things, Mr. Sullivan." From his chair by the fire, Daniel looked up sharply, studying Sarah with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. That night, when Sarah had gone to check on the animals and his mother had climbed to the loft to sleep, Garrett found himself alone with his father for the first time in years. The silence between them had weight, substance. "Mother seems happy here," Garrett finally said. Daniel nodded, continuing to whittle what was taking shape as a small horse. "Your mother finds joy wherever she lands, always has." He paused. "It's why she forgave you so easily." Garrett stiffened. "For what?" "For choosing a war over your pregnant wife, for building your fortune while we struggled, for sending money instead of coming home." The old anger rose in Garrett's chest. "I fought because it was right. The Union needed—" "I don't give a damn what the Union needed," Daniel cut him off. "Elizabeth needed you. When she died bringing your son into the world. We needed you. Not your money, Sullivan. You. Garrett stood, unable to sit still under the weight of his father's judgment. You're one to talk about choosing sides. You and your Southern sympathies. I sympathized with neighbors, not causes. Daniel's voice remained level. I nursed wounds. I didn't make them. Is that why you couldn't look at me when I came home in uniform? Garrett's voice rose. Because I made wounds? I couldn't look at you, Daniel said slowly, because every time I did, I saw Elizabeth standing at the window, watching the road, waiting for you to come home. The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air along with Sarah. She looked between them, sensing the tension, but said nothing as she hung her shawl by the door. Garrett turned away, staring into the fire as if it held answers. The next morning, as Sarah tended to his hand, rewrapping the bandage, she spoke without looking up. Your father loves you, you know. Garrett snorted. He has a strange way of showing it. Most men do. Her fingers were gentle despite her brusque manner. War changes how men express love, makes them believe strength means silence. You know a lot about war for a frontier widow. Something flickered across her face. I know enough. She secured the bandage. How did you hurt your hand, really? The axe slipped. No, she cut him off. Your mind slipped. The axe followed. What were you thinking about when it happened? Garrett looked away. Elizabeth, my wife. She died in childbirth while I was away fighting. The baby too. Sarah nodded as if confirming something she already suspected. And you've been running ever since. Not running, building, working. Same thing, different name. She stood. The supplies are dwindling. The flour sacks nearly empty. Salt's almost gone. Garrett welcomed the change of subject. I'll ride to town tomorrow, buy what we need. Sarah's jaw tightened. We're fine. You're not fine. You're running out. We'll manage, Mr. Sullivan. Why won't you let me help? Frustration edged his voice. Is your pride worth going hungry? Sarah's eyes flashed. My pride is all I have left, Mr. Sullivan. When Thomas died, this town watched me struggle through that first winter. The bank tried to take this land. The pastor suggested I sell and move east to family I don't have. No one helped. Not one neighbor brought food or firewood or offered a kind word. She took a step closer to him. I survived because I refused to break. I won't become a charity case now just because you feel guilty. It's not charity, Garrett insisted. It's payment for looking after my parents. Payment, Sarah's voice was flat. That's all it ever is with you, isn't it? Money to solve problems? Money instead of presents. She turned away. Keep your coins, Mr. Sullivan. I don't want them. That night, unable to sleep, Garrett found Sarah sitting alone by the dying fire. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft snores from the loft and the occasional pop from the burning logs. Why did you save them? He asked quietly, sitting across from her. My parents. You could have left them in the barn. Sarah stared into the embers. Because it was right. Even knowing who they were, who I am. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. I didn't know who they were, only that they needed help. She paused. Though your mother told me later about you, your success, how proud she was despite everything. Garrett felt a pang of guilt. And my father? What did he say about me? Nothing at first. Then one night, he said you did what you thought was right, even when it cost you everything. She tilted her head. He said it was both your greatest strength and your deepest flaw. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice softer than he'd heard before. I saw you found Thomas's grave. Garrett nodded. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? She looked at him directly. Or are you sorry for your own? The question caught him off guard. Both, I suppose. Tell me about her. Your Elizabeth. No one had asked him that in years. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush. He told Sarah about Elizabeth's laugh, her love of books, the way she could calm the wildest horse with just a few whispered words. How she'd been so happy about the baby, even as he'd been terrified. How he'd promised to be home for the birth, but had been delayed by a battle that, in the grand scheme of the war, had meant nothing. I thought I was fighting for a better world for them, he said, voice hollow. Instead, I lost my world entirely. And so you built a new one, of timber and cattle and banknotes. I couldn't stop moving, he admitted. Stillness terrified me. If I stopped, I'd have to feel it. The loss, the failure. Stillness isn't weakness, Sarah said softly. It's where healing starts. She placed her hand over his bandaged palm. He didn't pull away. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the first birds of morning began to sing. 2 days later, 4 horses appeared outside the cabin. Sarah opened the door to find Pastor Morrison and 3 town councilmen on her porch, hats in hand, faces grim. Her stomach turned to ice. "Mrs. Winters," the pastor said, "we need to speak with Mr. Sullivan." Garrett appeared behind her. "I'm here." The pastor cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, this arrangement is unseemly. You're a man of standing. She's a widow. You're living under one roof without proper—" "Get out," Sarah interrupted. The pastor blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said get out of my home. Mrs. Winters, we're only concerned for your reputation." "My reputation?" Her voice shook with barely controlled anger. "Where were you when I was starving last winter? Where were you when Thomas died and the bank tried to take this land?" She stepped forward, forcing the men to back up. "I don't need your concern. I don't need your judgment. And I sure as hell don't need you telling me who can stay in my home." One of the councilmen spoke up. "Mr. Sullivan, you must either leave or make your intentions honorable." "Surely you see," Sarah turned to Garrett, waiting for him to speak. He opened his mouth, closed it. Fear flickered in his eyes. Fear of commitment, fear of loss, fear of risking his heart again. He said nothing. The silence stretched like a chasm. Before Garrett could find his voice, Daniel appeared in the doorway behind them, his tall frame filling the space. "I have something to say," he announced to the councilman. "Mr. Sullivan," Pastor Morrison began, "with all due respect." "This woman," Daniel continued as if the pastor hadn't spoken, "is no stranger to our family." He turned to Sarah. "I recognize you now. Gettysburg, Field Hospital number 7. You were the nurse who saved my life. You stitched the wound from cannon shrapnel and stayed when the Union forces advanced." Sarah stared at Daniel, astonished. You were that federal soldier? The one who accepted water from enemy hands?" Daniel nodded. "I was too weak to recognize you when we arrived, but I remember now. You said that on the battlefield, there are only people, not sides." Garrett looked from his father to Sarah, confused. Daniel continued, his voice strong. "This woman saved my life during the war and saved it again in the fire. She is a benefactor to the Sullivan family. And if you gentlemen are concerned with honor, then start by repaying that debt of honor." The councilman shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Pastor Morrison adjusted his collar. "Be that as it may, there is nothing more to discuss," Daniel said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife is resting and we have work to do." With reluctance, the men mounted their horses and rode away. But their visit had awakened the old fears in Garrett. That night, as everyone slept, he quietly packed his saddlebags, left a pouch of money on the table with a note of apology, and slipped away into the darkness. Garrett's ranch was exactly as he'd left it, grand, empty, silent. He sat in his study for 3 days, staring at account ledgers, numbers that meant nothing, contracts that felt like chains. His ranch foreman came and went, reporting on cattle counts and fence repairs, speaking to a master who barely heard him. On the 4th night, Garrett found himself standing outside the nursery door. He'd locked it 2 years ago and never opened it since. His hands shook as he turned the key. Inside, dust covered everything. The cradle sat in the corner, a folded quilt draped over the edge, a rocking horse, a shelf of books he'd never read aloud. Garrett sank to his knees and wept. The next morning, he summoned Hiram Blackwood, manager of Sullivan Valley Bank, to explain the foreclosure notice on Sarah Winters' property. The thin, pinch-faced man shifted nervously in his chair. "It's simply business, Mr. Sullivan. The woman hasn't made a payment in over a year." "That woman is currently housing my parents after their home burned down," Garrett said coldly. "A home, I might add, that was fully paid for and uninsured. She's feeding them with what little she has while you're trying to take her land." I didn't realize the connection," Blackwood stammered. What else don't I realize, Hiram? What other business are you conducting in my name? Under Garrett's relentless questioning, the truth emerged. Blackwood had been systematically foreclosing on small properties surrounding the Sullivan Ranch, with plans to sell them to the railroad for an enormous profit. Sarah's land was the final piece in the puzzle. I was doing it for you, Hiram insisted. We stand to make a fortune from the railroad. At the expense of how many families? Garrett's voice was dangerously quiet. How many widows and orphans? How many honest, hard-working people? They're nothing, Blackwood said dismissively. Small holdings, small minds. They're in the way of progress, Mr. Sullivan. Your progress. Garrett stared at the man he'd entrusted with his business affairs, seeing him clearly for the first time. In Hiram's calculating eyes, Garrett saw a reflection of what he himself had become, a man who valued wealth over people, expansion over connection. You're fired, Hiram, Garrett said quietly. Pack your things and be out of town by nightfall. You can't be serious, Blackwood spluttered. After everything I've done for you. You've done nothing for me, Garrett interrupted. You've done things for yourself using my name and my money. That ends today. He stood. And one more thing. Draw up papers canceling all foreclosure proceedings initiated in the last year. Every single one, especially Sarah Winters. As Blackwood left, cursing under his breath, Garrett turned to the window. In the distance, he could see the mountains where Sarah's cabin perched, where his parents were, where for the first time in years he had felt something other than the cold drive to accumulate more. A messenger arrived that evening as Garrett was preparing to return to the cabin, bringing news that chilled him to the bone. Daniel Sullivan had suffered a heart attack, a delayed consequence of his old war wound. Sarah was using her nursing skills to keep him alive, but his condition was deteriorating. Without hesitation, Garrett loaded a wagon with supplies, medicine, food, building materials, everything the cabin might need. But before he left, he made one final stop. The cemetery lay quiet under a blanket of snow. Elizabeth's grave was simple, marked by a stone he'd commissioned but never visited. He knelt before it, brushing snow from the inscription. I've been running from you, he said aloud, from the baby, from everything we lost. I thought if I kept moving, kept building, I could outrun the pain. He paused. But I can't, and I'm done trying. I can't bring you back, but I can stop wasting the life you gave me. I can stop being afraid. From his pocket, he withdrew the small wooden horse his father had been carving. Daniel had finished it the day before Garrett left, sliding it across the table with no words of explanation. Now Garrett understood. It wasn't just a toy. It was a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope. As the sun began to set, Garrett mounted his horse and headed back toward Ridge Creek, the laden wagon following behind. This time, he wasn't fleeing from something. He was riding toward something, toward family, toward healing, toward home. Garrett rode through the night, the wagon's runners cutting smooth paths through fresh snow. The gelding strained against the harness, sensing its rider's urgency. Stars glittered overhead in the cold, clear sky, offering just enough light to navigate the familiar trail to Ridge Creek. Each mile brought memories of childhood summers spent exploring these hills, of his father teaching him to track deer through these same forests, of Elizabeth riding beside him during their courtship, her laughter echoing among the pines. But these memories no longer crippled him with grief. They accompanied him like old friends, reminding him of who he'd been and who he might become again. Dawn broke as he crested the final ridge. The small cabin came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Someone was awake despite the early hour. As he drew closer, the door opened and Sarah stepped onto the porch, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched his approach, her face unreadable in the gray morning light. Garrett halted the wagon and dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance, he with his laden wagon, a peace offering of sorts, she with her proud stance, unbending despite everything. You left, Sarah said finally, her breath clouding in the cold air. I did. Garrett stepped forward, leaving the horse and wagon behind, and I'll regret it the rest of my life. Then why come back? Because I'm done running. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, close enough now to see the exhaustion in her eyes. the worry lines etched around her mouth. "How is he?" Sarah's composure wavered. "Not good. The heart attack was severe. His old war wound never fully healed inside." She paused. "I've done what I can, but he needs more than I can give him here." "I brought medicine," Garrett said, "and supplies. Lumber to expand the cabin, seeds for spring planting, tools for repairs." "Why?" The simple question held layers of meaning. Garrett met her gaze. "Because I'm asking if you'll have me. Let me stay. Not as a guest, not as charity, but as a partner." Sarah studied him, searching for truth or deceit in his face. "You left once before." "I know." His voice cracked. "But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." He gestured to the wagon. "Those aren't just supplies, Sarah. They're a promise." She looked past him at the wagon, at the bounty he'd brought. Her expression softened slightly, then she remembered herself. "Your father's inside," she said quietly. "He needs you." Garrett nodded and followed her into the cabin's warmth. The interior was dim, lit only by the fire and a single oil lamp. His mother sat by Daniel's bedside holding his hand, her face drawn with worry. She looked up when Garrett entered, relief flooding her features. "Son," she whispered, "you came back." "I should never have left, Ma." Garrett crossed to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then he looked down at his father. Daniel Sullivan lay still beneath layers of quilts, his face ashen, breathing labored. He'd aged a decade in the short time since Garrett had seen him last. The strong, stubborn man who'd built a home in this wilderness with nothing but determination in his own two hands now looked fragile, diminished. "Pa," Garrett said, sinking to his knees beside the bed. He took his father's other hand, roughened by decades of work, now limp in his grasp. "I'm here." Daniel's eyes flickered open, focusing slowly. Recognition dawned, along with something else. Not the anger or disappointment Garrett expected, but something softer. "Sullivan," he whispered, the old habit of using the surname still present even now. "No, Pa, it's Garrett." He squeezed the worn hand. "Your son." A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. "About time you remembered that." Sarah moved quietly around them, preparing a tincture at the small table. Clara made room for her son, moving to help Sarah while giving Garrett this moment with his father. "I brought medicine," Garrett said, "and a doctor from town will come when the trail clears." Daniel's eyes drifted closed. "No need to fuss." "There's every need," Garrett replied firmly. "You're not done yet, old man. You've got more stories to tell, more horses to carve." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around Garrett's hand. "Stubborn, like your mother." Garrett smiled through the tightness in his throat. "Wonder where I got it from." Sarah approached with a cup of steaming liquid. "He needs to drink this," she said quietly. "It will help with the pain and strengthen his heart." Together they raised Daniel enough to sip the bitter medicine. His face contorted at the taste, but Sarah was firm. "All of it, Mr. Sullivan. Doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor," Daniel grumbled, but he drank. "Near enough on a battlefield," she replied, her tone softening. "And you're not my first stubborn, Sullivan." As Daniel settled back, Sarah motioned for Garrett to follow her to the main room. His mother took his place at the bedside, humming softly as she stroked her husband's forehead. "The medicine will help," Sarah said, keeping her voice low. "But he needs real doctors, real care, the kind I can't provide here." "I've sent for Dr. Wilkins from Cedar Valley," Garrett replied, "and I'm prepared to bring specialists from Denver if necessary." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "All your money still talking, Mr. Sullivan?" "No," he said firmly. "This is my father we're discussing. I'll use every resource I have, not out of guilt, but out of love." She studied him, then nodded. "Fair enough. But he can't be moved yet. The journey could kill him faster than his heart. Then we'll make this place what he needs." Garrett gestured to the cabin. "I brought lumber, supplies. We can expand, make a proper sick room, whatever's necessary." "We," Sarah echoed, that single word carrying weight. "Yes, we." Garrett held her gaze. "If you'll allow it." After a long moment, Sarah nodded. "For your father's sake." "For his sake," Garrett agreed, though they both sensed there was more to it than that. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Garrett unpacked the wagon, stocking the small pantry with more food than it had likely ever held. He cleared space in the lean-to for his horse and began splitting logs for an addition to the cabin. Sarah focused on Daniel's care, brewing medicines from her dwindling supply of herbs, monitoring his condition with the precision of a trained nurse. On the morning of the fourth day, as Garrett was measuring lumber for the addition, a question that had been bothering him finally surfaced. "How did a southern woman learn such northern medicine?" he asked as Sarah joined him outside, taking a rare break from Daniel's bedside. "Moise." She stiffened slightly. "What makes you think I'm southern?" "Your accent slips sometimes, especially when you're tired. And my father recognized you from Gettysburg, which means you were with the Confederate Medical Corps." Sarah sighed, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Does that matter now? The war's been over for 20 years. "It matters because I'm trying to understand you," Garrett said, "and because you clearly know more about my father than I realized." She was quiet for a long moment, then sat on a stump, pulling her shawl tighter. "I was born in Virginia. My father was a doctor. When the war came, he joined the Confederate Medical Service, and I went with him as his assistant." Her eyes took on a distant look. "After Antietam, there weren't enough trained nurses. I learned by necessity, stitching wounds, amputating limbs, comforting the dying." "In Gettysburg?" "My father was killed at Chancellorsville. I stayed on, moving with the Army. At Gettysburg, our field hospital was overrun when Lee retreated. The Union forces brought their wounded to the same tents. Suddenly, I was caring for men in blue instead of gray." She met his gaze directly. "That's when I realized what my father had always said was true. Under the uniform, the wounds are the same. The pain is the same. The fear is the same." "And that's where you met my father?" Sarah nodded. "Cannon shrapnel had torn through his side. By all rights, he should have died, but he was stubborn." A small smile touched her lips. "He fought for every breath. When I asked his name, he just said Sullivan. Wouldn't give his first name, as if that would be surrendering too much to a rebel nurse." Garrett shook his head, all too familiar with his father's stubborn pride. "How did you end up here in Wyoming?" "After the war, there was nothing left for me in Virginia. Our home had been destroyed, our practice gone. I worked my way west, nursing in frontier towns. In Denver, I met Thomas." Her expression softened at the memory. "He was a Union veteran, ironically, a carpenter building the new courthouse. We married a month later and headed for Wyoming to claim land under the Homestead Act." "Did he know about your Confederate past?" "Of course. Thomas believed the war was behind us, that it was time to build something new together." Her voice caught slightly. "We had 2 good years before the fever took him." Garrett let the silence stretch between them, absorbing this new understanding of the complex woman before him. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me, for saving my father. Twice now." Sarah stood, brushing snow from her skirt. "Saving him is the easy part, Mr. Sullivan. The hard part is what comes next." "Which is?" "Healing." She looked toward the cabin. "Not just his body, but what lies between you. That will take more than medicine or money." Before Garrett could respond, the distant sound of hooves drew their attention. A single rider approached through the trees, the blue-black coat marking him as Dr. Wilkins from Cedar Valley. "Your doctor has arrived," Sarah said, moving toward the cabin. "Let's hope he lives up to your expensive expectations." Dr. Wilkins confirmed what Sarah had already determined. Daniel had suffered a serious heart attack, likely triggered by smoke inhalation from the fire and complicated by his old war wound. He left additional medicines and instructions, but his prognosis was guarded at best. "Keep him calm, warm, and well-fed," the doctor instructed as he prepared to leave. "No exertion, no excitement, and send for me at the first sign of another attack." After the doctor departed, Sarah organized the new medicines while Garrett resumed work on the addition. The sound of his hammer punctuated the quiet afternoon as he framed the extension that would nearly double the cabin size. Clara came outside, bundled against the cold, and watched him work. "It's good to see you building something with your hands again," she said, pride evident in her voice. "You were always good at it, even as a boy." Garrett smiled, driving another nail. "Pa taught me well, though I've forgotten more than I care to admit." "You haven't forgotten," Clara said gently. "You just set it aside for a while." She approached, touching the rough-hewn frame. Sarah says this will be a sick room for your father. For now, later it can be whatever she needs. A proper bedroom, a sitting room. He hesitated. If she'll let me do this for her. Clara studied her son. She's a proud woman, reminds me of your father. Stubborn, you mean? Independent, Clara corrected. Self-reliant. It's how they both survived. She paused. Did you know she refused help from everyone after Thomas died? Even when she was clearly struggling? Garrett nodded, thinking of the thin patched clothes, the nearly empty pantry. She told me the town wasn't exactly forthcoming with assistance. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Clara lowered her voice. Pastor Morrison arranged for the church to help her. Food, firewood, even money. She refused all of it. Said she didn't want charity disguised as Christian kindness. Garrett frowned. What's the difference between charity and kindness? Intent, Clara said simply. Charity makes the giver feel good about themselves. Kindness comes from recognizing yourself in another's struggle. She smiled sadly. Your father understood that difference. It's why he never accepted your money but treasured the letters you wrote, few as they were. The words struck home. Garrett set down his hammer, truly looking at his mother for the first time in years. The silver in her hair, the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of time he'd missed, struggles he'd been absent for. I'm sorry, Ma, he said quietly, for staying away, for thinking money could substitute for presence. Clara touched his cheek, a gesture so familiar it almost broke him. You're here now, that's what matters. Is it enough, though? He asked. After everything? That depends, she replied, on whether you're here to stay or just passing through again. Before he could answer, Sarah appeared at the doorway, her expression urgent. He's asking for you, Garrett, both of you. Daniel was awake, propped up slightly against the pillows. His breathing seemed easier than before, but his complexion remained ashen. He gestured weakly for them to come closer. Need to talk, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. While I still can. Don't be dramatic, Daniel, Clara chided gently, sitting beside him. Dr. Wilkins said you'll recover if you rest. If, Daniel emphasized, he looked at Garrett. Things to say first, important things. Garrett pulled a chair close to the bed's other side. I'm listening, Pa. Daniel drew a labored breath. The fire wasn't an accident. A cold feeling settled in Garrett's stomach. What do you mean? Man came 2 days before, asking about selling the homestead. Daniel's eyes closed briefly with the effort of speaking. Said the railroad needed the land. Offered money. Not enough. Garrett exchanged a look with his mother. Did you recognize him? City man, fancy clothes, called himself a representative of progress. Daniel's mouth twisted. Threatened that we'd regret refusing. Thought he was talking to an old fool who didn't understand business. The pieces fell into place in Garrett's mind. Blackwood, he said grimly. Hiram Blackwood. Daniel nodded weakly. Found his card after. In your office. Your banker. Shame and rage warred within Garrett. His own employee using his name, threatening his parents, and then making good on that threat. I fired him, Garrett said, 3 days ago, and canceled all his schemes, including the railroad deal. Good, Daniel said, satisfaction briefly lighting his tired eyes. Never trusted him. Reminded me of the carpetbaggers after the war. Sarah, who had been quietly mixing more medicine by the fire, approached the bed. You need to rest now, Mr. Sullivan. This much talking isn't good for your heart. Daniel shook his head stubbornly. One more thing. He looked at Garrett. The strongbox. Did it survive the fire? Garrett frowned, confused. I didn't look for it. I was more concerned about finding you and Ma. Need to find it, Daniel insisted, becoming agitated. Important papers inside. Deeds, letters, family history. I'll go tomorrow, Garrett promised, placing a calming hand on his father's shoulder. First light, I'll find it if it's there. This seemed to satisfy Daniel. He relaxed back against the pillows, allowing Sarah to administer the medicine. Soon he drifted into sleep, his breathing steadier than before. Outside the sick room, Garrett paced the small main area of the cabin. Blackwood, he muttered. I should have seen it. The foreclosures, the pressure on small landowners. It was all part of his plan to secure the right-of-way for the railroad. And your parents' land was part of that plan, Sarah concluded, washing her hands in a basin. When they refused to sell, he decided to remove the obstacle. Garrett's hands clenched into fists. He tried to burn them out. Maybe even he couldn't finish the thought, the possibility too horrific to voice. They survived, Sarah reminded him gently. Focus on that. Garrett nodded, forcing himself to calm down. Tomorrow I'll ride to the homestead, look for the strong box, then to town to make sure Blackwood is gone for good. And if he isn't? Sarah asked, studying him. Then I'll deal with him. Garrett's voice was hard. Legally, through the sheriff. I won't sink to his level. Sarah seemed satisfied with this answer. Good, your father needs healing, not vengeance. What about justice? Garrett challenged. Doesn't he deserve that too? Justice and vengeance often wear the same coat, Sarah replied. Be careful which one you're reaching for. The next morning, Garrett rode to the burned-out homestead. In the clear light of day, the destruction seemed even more complete. The cabin where he'd grown up was nothing but charred timbers and ash. He dismounted, tying his horse to the remains of the porch railing, and began to search. The strong box, if it had survived, would be in his father's hidden cellar, a small space beneath the main room, accessed by a trapdoor under the rug. Garrett had helped dig it as a boy, sworn to secrecy by his father. Every man needs a place to keep his treasures safe, Daniel had told him. Ash and snow covered everything, making it difficult to orient himself among the ruins. Garrett worked systematically, clearing debris until he found the remnants of the stone hearth. From there, he could determine where the trapdoor should be. Hours passed as he dug through layers of charred floorboards and collapsed roof beams. His hands grew raw and blistered, but he continued, driven by determination and the promise he'd made to his father. Finally, near midday, his shovel struck metal. The trapdoor had partially melted, its hinges fused shut by the intense heat of the fire, but it had served its purpose. Beneath it, the small cellar remained intact. And there, wrapped in oilcloth and remarkably undamaged, sat Daniel Sullivan's strongbox. Garrett lifted it reverently. The metal was hot to the touch despite the surrounding snow, as if it still held the memory of the fire. He carried it to his horse, securing it carefully in his saddlebags, then mounted and headed toward Cedar Valley. This town was quiet when he arrived, midday lull leaving the main street nearly deserted. Garrett tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and entered, the strongbox tucked under his arm. Sheriff Taylor looked up from his desk, surprise registering on his weathered face. Sullivan, heard you were back in the area. He nodded toward the window. Sorry about your folks' place. That's why I'm here, Garrett said, taking a seat across from the lawman. It wasn't an accident, Tom. The sheriff's expression sharpened. Explain. Garrett laid out everything. Blackwood's scheme with the railroad, the threats to his parents, the fire that followed their refusal to sell. As he spoke, the sheriff's face grew increasingly grim. That's a serious accusation, Garrett, he said when Garrett finished. Arson is hanging offense, especially if folks had died. I know. That's why I'm bringing it to you officially. Garrett leaned forward. Is Blackwood still in town? Sheriff Taylor shook his head. Left 3 days ago. Said he was heading to Cheyenne on bank business. He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. I can send wires, have him detained for questioning. Do it, Garrett said firmly, and I'll sign whatever statements you need. After completing the necessary paperwork, Garrett headed to the Sullivan Valley Bank. As majority owner, he needed to ensure Blackwood hadn't left any other unpleasant surprises behind. The bank manager, a nervous man named Simmons, who had worked under Blackwood, practically wilted when Garrett walked through the door. Mr. Sullivan, we weren't expecting you. Mr. Blackwood said you were away on business. Mr. Blackwood no longer represents me or this bank, Garrett interrupted. I need to see all foreclosure notices issued in the past year. Every one of them. But sir, that's dozens of properties. It will take time to... Then you'd better start now. Garrett's tone left no room for argument. 3 hours later, the full extent of Blackwood's scheme became clear. He had systematically targeted small landholders along the proposed railroad route, manufacturing reasons for foreclosure or offering below-market purchases. Those who refused, like Daniel and Clara, faced increasing pressure, and in at least one case, unexplained accidents. Garrett authorized immediate cancellation of all foreclosure proceedings and sent notices to every affected property owner. For those who had already lost their land, he authorized repurchase at the original sale price, with additional compensation for hardship. But sir, Simmons protested weakly, this will cost the bank thousands. The shareholders, I am the primary shareholder, Garrett reminded him, and I'd rather lose money than lose my soul. He signed the final document with a flourish. See that these are processed immediately, Simmons. Your continued employment depends on it. As dusk approached, Garrett made one final stop before returning to Ridge Creek. The general store owned by the widow Chen was small but well-stocked, known for fair prices and the owner's uncanny ability to procure almost anything given time. Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman with shrewd eyes who had come to Wyoming by way of San Francisco 20 years earlier, greeted Garrett with obvious surprise. Mr. Sullivan, you honor my humble shop. Her English was perfect, with just a hint of an accent. What can I provide for you today? I need supplies for Ridge Creek, Garrett said, for Sarah Winter's cabin. Mrs. Chen's expression changed subtly. Ah, Mrs. Winters, a good woman, very proud. Yes, she is, Garrett smiled slightly. That's why I'd appreciate your discretion in this matter. Understanding dawned in Mrs. Chen's eyes. Of course, these supplies are from you, but not from you. I understand perfectly. She tapped her temple. Business requires diplomacy. Garrett provided a list of items, medicines, fabric, tools, seeds for spring planting, and special comforts for an invalid. Mrs. Chen nodded as she reviewed it. Most I have in stock. The rest I can order from Denver. Will arrive in 2 weeks, weather permitting. Perfect. And I'd like weekly deliveries of fresh supplies, meat, vegetables, whatever's available. Garrett placed a substantial deposit on the counter. Beginning tomorrow, if possible. Mrs. Chen counted the money carefully, then looked up at Garrett with new respect. Tomorrow, yes, my son will deliver at midday. She hesitated, then added, Mrs. Winters does not accept charity easily. How shall we explain? Garrett considered this. Tell her it's payment for caring for my parents, that the town has finally recognized its debt to her. Ah, Mrs. Chen smiled faintly. A matter of honor, not charity. Yes, this she might accept. She bowed slightly. You are wiser than you appear, Mr. Sullivan. As Garrett turned to leave, Mrs. Chen spoke again. One moment. She disappeared into the back of the shop, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper. For Mrs. Winters, no charge. Garrett accepted it, curious. What is it? Tea, special blend, good for heart patients. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. When my husband was ill, she came. Every day for a week, would not accept payment. She patted the package. Some debts must be repaid, even years later. It seemed Sarah had more allies in town than she realized, or would admit. Darkness had fallen by the time Garrett returned to the cabin. Light spilled from the windows, creating golden rectangles in the snow. He dismounted stiffly, his body aching from the day's exertions. The strong box seemed heavier now, its contents a mystery that weighed on him. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, relief briefly visible on her face before her usual composure returned. You're late, she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. Had more to do in town than expected. Garrett stomped snow from his boots and entered the warmth of the cabin. How is he? Sleeping now. His fever rose this afternoon but broke an hour ago. Your mother is with him. Garrett nodded, setting the strong box on the table. I found it, intact, remarkably. Sarah eyed the box. Good. He's been restless, asking about it whenever he wakes. She moved to the fire, stirring something that smelled delicious in the hanging pot. Are you hungry? Starving, Garrett admitted, suddenly aware he hadn't eaten since morning. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming him from the inside. Afterward, Sarah brought fresh bandages for his raw hands. You've been digging, she observed, cleaning dirt from his abrasions. The strong box was buried under half the cabin. Sarah worked methodically, her touch gentle despite her brisk manner. And your visit to town? Did you find your banker? Gone to Cheyenne, supposedly. Garrett winced as she applied a stinging salve. Sheriff Taylor is sending wires to have him detained. Good. Sarah wrapped clean cloth around his palm. What will you do when they find him? Be that he faces justice. Legal justice, P clarified, remembering their conversation from the previous night. The law will deal with him. Sarah nodded approvingly. And the bank? I'm reversing all foreclosures, including yours. Garrett met her gaze. Your land is secure. The deed will be sent over with the cleared title. She stiffened. I told you I don't want your... It's not charity, he interrupted. It's justice. Blackwood targeted you specifically because of this land's location. What I'm doing is correcting a wrong committed in my name, with my resources. Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. I suppose I can accept that distinction. There's more, Garrett continued. Mrs. Chen will be sending deliveries, regular supplies, food, medicine. And who's paying for these deliveries? Sarah's eyes narrowed. The town, Garrett said smoothly. Apparently, once certain facts came to light about your care for various citizens over the years, including Mrs. Chen's husband, the town council decided it was time to repay some debts. The town council? Sarah's voice was flat with disbelief. The same council that was ready to run me out of town for impropriety 2 days ago. People can change their minds when presented with new information. Garrett held her gaze steadily. Will you accept the supplies or not? After a long moment, Sarah nodded. For your parents' sake, and because your father needs proper nourishment to recover. Garrett smiled. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Later, as Sarah checked on Daniel, Garrett examined the strongbox. It was locked, the key likely lost in the fire. After a moment's consideration, he took it outside to the woodshed where his tools were stored. A few minutes' work with a chisel popped the lock. Inside, he found exactly what his father had described. Land deeds, including the original homestead grant signed by President Lincoln. Letters, many in faded ink and fragile with age. And a leather-bound family Bible, its pages yellowed but intact. At the bottom lay a small velvet pouch. Curious, Garrett opened it. Inside was a gold pocket watch and a daguerreotype of a young woman in Confederate dress. Beautiful, proud, with eyes that seemed to challenge the viewer. He turned it over. On the back, in fading ink, someone had written, Catherine Sullivan, Richmond, 1860. The name jolted him. Catherine Sullivan, his father's sister, the one never spoken of, who had married a southern plantation owner before the war. The family connection that had been severed when Virginia seceded. Garrett had heard of her only in whispers between his parents, never directly acknowledged by his father. This, then, was why the strongbox was so important to Daniel. Not just for the deeds and legal papers, but for this connection to a past he'd never publicly mourned. A sister lost not just to death, but to the divisions of war. The watch, Garrett realized, must have been hers or her husband's. A family heirloom his father had kept despite everything, a reminder of what the war had cost them all. He carefully returned everything to the box, securing it as best he could with the damaged lock, and brought it back inside. Sarah was sitting by the fire, knitting what appeared to be a new bandage from clean white cloth. Found something interesting? She asked, not looking up from her work. Family history, Garrett replied, setting the box on the table, including a relative I never knew my father cared about. His sister, Sarah said quietly, Catherine. He spoke of her during his fever dreams. Garrett looked at her sharply. You knew? Only what he mumbled in delirium, that she died at Richmond when the city fell, that he never got to say goodbye. Sarah's needles clicked rhythmically. The past has a way of surfacing when we're at our weakest. Garrett sat heavily in the chair opposite her. He never told me any of it. I knew he had Southern sympathies, but I never understood why. Family ties run deeper than political allegiances, Sarah observed, even in war, perhaps especially then. Is that why you stayed with the Confederate wounded, even as a Union nurse? Garrett asked. Family ties. Humanity, Sarah corrected. I stayed because suffering doesn't wear a uniform. They fell silent, the fire crackling between them, each lost in thoughts of a war long over but never truly ended. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the world in clean white. He'll want to see these things when he wakes, Garrett said finally, touching the strongbox. Yes, Sarah set aside her knitting, but not tonight. Tonight he needs rest more than memories. As if summoned by their conversation, Clara appeared from the sick room. He's awake, she said softly, asking for you both. They found Daniel propped against his pillows, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. When he saw the strongbox in Garrett's hands, a visible weight seemed to lift from him. "You found it," he said, voice stronger than before. "Intact," Garrett confirmed, placing it carefully on the bed beside his father. "Everything's there, Pa. The deeds, the letters, the Bible." He hesitated, then added, "and Aunt Catherine's picture." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, then he nodded. "You opened it." "Had to break the lock. Sorry." "No matter." Daniel's gnarled hand rested on the box. "Time you knew, anyway." He looked at Clara. "Help me sit up more." Sarah moved forward. "Mr. Sullivan, you shouldn't exert—" "Hush, woman," Daniel said, but without heat. "Some things are worth exertion." With Clara's help, he managed to sit more upright. He opened the box with trembling hands and withdrew the velvet pouch. From it, he took the daguerreotype, holding it so both Sarah and Garrett could see. "My sister," he said simply. "Brilliant girl, headstrong, married a Virginia tobacco planter named James Hartwell in '59. Had a son in '60. His voice grew rough. "When the war came, her husband joined the Confederate cavalry, died at Cold Harbor. Catherine stayed in Richmond, turned their home into a hospital for wounded soldiers." He looked directly at Sarah. "That's where you met her, isn't it, Fonette?" Sarah stared at the image, shock registering on her face. "Mrs. Hartwell," she whispered. "The lady surgeon." She looked up at Daniel. "She was your sister?" Daniel nodded. "When you mentioned trained as a doctor's daughter in Virginia, I started to wonder. When the fever came, I remembered more. Your voice, your hands, same as hers. That's why I trusted you from the start, though I couldn't place why." "She was remarkable," Sarah said softly. "Performed surgeries no woman was supposed to know how to do. Saved countless lives, Confederate and Union alike." Her voice caught. "She stayed in Richmond until the very end, refused to evacuate. The fire that swept the city after the Confederate withdrawal took her and many of her patients," Daniel finished. "I learned months later, after the surrender." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Never got to tell her I was sorry. For the words we exchanged when she chose the South. For the letters I returned unopened." Daniel's fingers traced the edge of the daguerreotype. "Catherine chose the South, you chose the North. And he paused. "I chose pride over family. Twice." Garrett looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "When you enlisted," Daniel said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the women in the other room, "I told myself it was about principles, about states' rights, about the government overreaching." He shook his head slowly. "But it wasn't. It was fear. Fear of losing another child to that damned war." "You never said—" "How could I?" Daniel's eyes, so like Garrett's own, finally met his son's directly. "How could I tell my Union-proud son that I'd already buried a nephew in Confederate gray, that I'd lost a sister to Richmond's fall, that every time I looked at your blue uniform, I saw their ghosts?" Understanding dawned on Garrett. "So instead you shut me out." "Easier to be angry than afraid," Daniel admitted. "When the telegram came about Elizabeth," his voice faltered, "I thought God was punishing me again. Taking your child like Catherine's had been taken, because I'd turned my back on family." "Why didn't you tell me this when I came home?" Garrett asked. "Pride," Daniel said simply. "Cursed Sullivan pride. By then the wall was too high, and you were building your own walls, your empire of land and cattle." A rough laugh escaped him. "Guess we're more alike than either of us wanted to admit." Clara placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Daniel, you couldn't have known." "But I should have forgiven," he replied, "before it was too late." He looked at Garrett. "That's what I wanted you to know, son, why I needed this box found." His hand gripped Garrett's with surprising strength. "Don't make my mistake. Don't let pride keep you from family, from forgiveness." The moment stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Then Daniel released his grip and settled back against the pillows, exhausted by the effort and emotion. "Enough for tonight," Sarah said firmly, taking the photograph and returning it to the pouch. "You need rest, Mr. Sullivan." For once, Daniel didn't argue. His eyes were already closing, the brief surge of energy fading. "Keep the box safe, Garrett," he murmured. "It's your history now." As Garrett and Sarah left the sick room, closing the door quietly behind them, A new understanding hung in the air between them. The past that had shaped them both. The war that had divided and connected them in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Will he recover? Garrett asked quietly. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. I believe so. He has a strong heart, despite everything. And now that he's shared this burden, she glanced back toward the closed door. Secrets can weigh heavier than any physical ailment. Letting them go is sometimes the best medicine. Is that why you told me about your Confederate service? Garrett asked. To let go of the secret? Perhaps. Sarah moved to bank the fire for the night. Or perhaps to help you understand that the lines we draw in war between North and South, right and wrong, friend and enemy, are rarely as clear as we believe. She looked at him directly, the firelight casting her face in soft gold. Your father and I should have been enemies. Instead, I saved his life, and 20 years later, he saved mine through his testimony to the town council. Your aunt and I should have been enemies, yet we worked side by side to preserve life amid destruction. And you and I? Garrett asked quietly. That, Sarah said, her voice equally soft, remains to be written, Mr. Sullivan. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the scars of the past with the promise of something new. The next 2 weeks brought steady change to the small cabin on Ridge Creek. Under Garrett's direction, the addition took shape rapidly. A proper bedroom for Daniel with large windows to let in the winter sunlight, a small sitting area, an expanded storage space that transformed the cramped dwelling into a comfortable home. Mrs. Chen's son, Wei, arrived faithfully every third day with deliveries. Each time, Sarah received the supplies with a mixture of reluctance and gratitude, her proud nature still struggling with accepting help. Garrett noticed, however, that her protest grew less vehement as Daniel's condition improved and the cabin's transformation progressed. By mid-March, the worst of winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the Wyoming highlands. Patches of ground emerged from melting snow, and the creek's ice thinned at the edges. Inside the cabin, Daniel Sullivan sat up in his new bed for the first time without assistance, color returning to his face along with his customary stubbornness. I'm not an invalid, he insisted when Sarah tried to prevent him from standing. Been lying in this bed long enough to grow roots. Another week of rest won't kill you, Sarah replied, unimpressed by his bluster. But getting up too soon might. The woman's right, Daniel, Clara added from her chair by the window. Dr. Wilkins was quite clear about your recovery time. Daniel scowled at them both. 2 women fussing worse than mother hens. Where's Garrett? At least he'll talk sense. He's finishing the roof on the new storage shed, Sarah said, and he'd agree with us if he were here. Daniel harumphed but settled back against his pillows. At least bring me something useful to do. Can't lie here staring at the ceiling all day. Sarah considered him for a moment, then nodded. I suppose some light woodworking wouldn't strain your heart too badly, if you stay in bed. She retrieved Daniel's carving tools and a few pieces of pine from the main room. His face brightened at the sight of them, hands reaching eagerly despite their weakness. What shall it be this time? Claire asked, smiling at her husband's childlike enthusiasm. Another horse? No, Daniel said thoughtfully, turning a piece of wood in his hands. Something different. Something for the future. As he began to carve, Sarah slipped outside, pulling her shawl tight against the crisp air. She found Garrett atop the new shed, hammering the final shingles into place. For a moment, she simply watched him work. The confident swing of the hammer, the sureness of his movements so different from the uncertain businessman who had arrived at her door nearly a month ago. Your father's awake, she called up to him, and demanding freedom from his medical oppressors. Garrett looked down and grinned. Sounds like he's feeling better. Well enough to complain, which is a good sign. Sarah shielded her eyes against the sun. I've given him his carving tools to keep him occupied. That was kind of you. Garrett hammered in one last nail, then made his way down the ladder. Up close, she could see the changes in him more clearly. His face tanned from outdoor work, his hands calloused in new places, his shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been before. It was practical, Sarah corrected, though a faint smile betrayed her. A bored Daniel Sullivan is a difficult patient. True enough, Garrett set his hammer in the toolbox. I was thinking of riding into town tomorrow. The sheriff sent word that Blackwood has been detained in Cheyenne. They need my formal statement. Sarah nodded, her expression sobering. Will you be gone long? A day, perhaps 2. He studied her face. Will you be all right here, with my father still recovering? We managed before you came, Mr. Sullivan, she reminded him. We'll manage while you're gone. Garrett, he said quietly. What? My name is Garrett. After all this time, I think you could use it. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Very well. Garrett. His name felt strange on her tongue, an intimacy she wasn't sure she was ready for. We'll be fine while you're in town. I know you will. He hesitated, then added, but I'll hurry back all the same. When Garrett arrived, the small gallery was already filled with curious townspeople. News of Blackwood's arrest and the accusations against him had spread quickly, fueled by the dramatic story of the Sullivan homestead fire and Daniel's near death. Blackwood sat at a table near the front, flanked by two territorial marshals. His once immaculate appearance had deteriorated, his suit wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When he spotted Garrett, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and resentment. The territorial judge, a stern-faced man named Hollister, called the hearing to order. This is a preliminary examination into the charges against Hiram Blackwood, he announced. The purpose is to determine if sufficient evidence exists to hold the accused for trial on charges of arson, attempted murder, and fraudulent business practices. The proceedings moved efficiently. Sheriff Taylor presented the physical evidence found at the Sullivan homestead, traces of coal oil on the remaining timbers, clear signs that the fire had been deliberately set. Then came witnesses, the station master who'd seen Blackwood arguing with Daniel Sullivan 3 days before the fire, the bank clerk who testified about Blackwood's aggressive foreclosure policies, and finally Garrett himself. He spoke clearly, detailing Blackwood's scheme to acquire land for the railroad and the threats made against property owners who refused to sell. When he described finding his parents' home in ashes, believing them possibly dead, a murmur ran through the crowd. And you believe, Mr. Sullivan, Judge Hollister asked, that the defendant set this fire with the intent to either force your parents from their land or cause them harm? I do, Your Honor. Garrett's voice was steady. The evidence points clearly to Mr. Blackwood's involvement, either directly or through hired men. The judge turned to Blackwood. Does the accused wish to make a statement at this time? Blackwood rose, straightening his rumpled jacket in a pathetic attempt at dignity. Your Honor, these accusations are absurd. I have served the Sullivan banking interests faithfully for years. Everything I did was for the greater prosperity of this region. He pointed a shaking finger at Garrett. He approved all my actions. The railroad deal would have made us both wealthy beyond imagination. I never approved threatening or harming innocent people, Garrett replied coldly. Business requires difficult decisions. Blackwood's voice rose hysterically. Progress demands sacrifice. Those backward homesteaders, were standing in the way of civilization. Judge Hollister banged his gavel. Control yourself, Mr. Blackwood. But Blackwood was beyond control, his carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. You self-righteous hypocrite, he shouted at Garrett. You were happy enough to profit from my methods until they touched your precious family. How many other families lost their homes while you counted your money in that mansion of yours? The accusation struck home. Garrett had indeed been willfully blind to the source of his bank's profits, content to leave the details to Blackwood while he expanded his cattle empire. His complicity through negligence was a burden he would carry. Before Garrett could respond, Blackwood lunged forward, evading the marshal's grasp and crossing the short distance to where Garrett stood. You're no better than me, Sullivan, he hissed, close enough that Garrett could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. We're cut from the same cloth, men who take what we want. That's enough. Sheriff Taylor moved to restrain Blackwood, but Garrett raised a hand to stop him. No, let him speak, Garrett said, his voice steady as he faced Blackwood directly. Everyone should hear this. The courtroom fell silent, the spectators leaning forward in anticipation. You're wrong, Hiram, Garrett said quietly. We're not the same. I was blind. Yes. Negligent. Yes. But I never set fire to a man's home. I never tried to burn an elderly couple alive in their beds. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. They weren't supposed to be there. The words escaped before he could stop them, a damning admission that drew gasps from the crowd. What did you say? Judge Hollister demanded, leaning forward on the bench. Realizing his mistake, Blackwood paled visibly. I, I didn't mean. They weren't supposed to be there, Garrett repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You knew their routine. Knew they usually spent Wednesday nights in town with friends. But that night there was a storm, so they stayed home. Isn't that right, Hiram? Sweat beaded on Blackwood's forehead. You can't prove anything. Your hired man confessed, Sheriff Taylor interjected, stepping forward with a folded paper. Signage statement. Said you paid him $50 to burn that old shack when nobody was home, so the Sullivan land would be cleared for the railroad. Blackwood's shoulders slumped, the last of his defiance evaporating. It was just business, he whispered. Just business. No, Garrett said, turning to face the courtroom full of people who had once respected him for his wealth alone. It was greed, my greed too, for letting it happen under my name. He looked back at Blackwood. The difference between us, Hiram, is that I'm willing to make it right. Judge Hollister studied them both, then nodded decisively. I've heard enough. Hiram Blackwood will be held over for trial on all charges. Trial date to be set within 60 days. As the marshals led Blackwood away, he turned for one last venomous glare at Garrett. You think this makes you a good man? He spat. Playing the hero? Building a little love nest with that backwoods widow? Garrett stiffened at the mention of Sarah. Blackwood saw the reaction and smiled cruelly. Oh yes, I know all about your arrangement. My contacts say you're quite comfortable together. Tell me, does she know how many families you've displaced for your cattle empire? How many widows like her have lost everything because of Sullivan Bank's foreclosures? Garrett moved forward, but Sheriff Taylor blocked his path. He's not worth it, son, the older man cautioned. He's just trying to provoke you. You're right, Garrett agreed after a tense moment, forcing himself to relax. But he's also right about one thing. I have much to answer for. He raised his voice so everyone in the courtroom could hear, which is why, effective immediately, Sullivan Bank will suspend all foreclosure proceedings. Anyone who lost their property through my bank's actions in the past 3 years can apply for review and potential reinstatement of ownership. Murmurs of shock rippled through the gallery. Blackwood's face contorted with disgust. Fool! You'll ruin everything we built. No, Garrett replied as the marshals resumed leading Blackwood away. I'm going to build something better. Something that won't burn down in the night. After the hearing, Sheriff Taylor approached Garrett. That took courage, he said, admitting your part in it. Garrett shook his head. Not courage, honesty. There's a difference. Still, Taylor clapped him on the shoulder. Most men in your position would have laid all the blame on Blackwood. I'm trying not to be most men anymore, Garrett replied. He looked around the emptying courtroom, at the townspeople watching him with new eyes, some respectful, others still wary. I have a lot to make right into this town. After the hearing, Garrett visited the telegraph office to send wires to his ranch foreman and to business associates in Denver, reorganizing his affairs to allow his extended stay at Ridge Creek. Then he stopped at Mrs. Chen's store to arrange additional deliveries and purchase special items he thought might brighten the cabin. A colorful quilt, a set of leather-bound books, seeds for spring planting. Mrs. Chen watched him select these items with knowing eyes. Mrs. Winters will say these are too much, she observed. Too expensive. Probably, Garrett agreed, adding a package of expensive tea to his purchases. But sometimes people need to accept gifts, even when pride says otherwise. Wise words. Mrs. Chen wrapped his selections carefully. You are changing, Mr. Sullivan. Like river changing course after winter ice breaks. Garrett smiled slightly. Let's hope it's a change for the better. Better already, she assured him. But river must be patient. Some banks take longer to shape. He understood her meaning. Sarah's walls had been built over years of self-reliance and hardship. They wouldn't come down overnight, no matter how earnestly he tried to breach them. As he prepared to leave town, Garrett made one final stop at the small church. He found Pastor Morrison in his study, surrounded by books and papers. Mr. Sullivan? The pastor rose, clearly surprised by the visit. What brings you to our humble church? A matter of conscience, Pastor. Garrett remained standing, declining the offered chair. I wanted to discuss Sarah Winters. Morrison's expression grew guarded. Mrs. Winters is a complicated subject. She shouldn't be, Garrett from any. Garrett said, she's a good woman who's been treated poorly by this town, by this church. Now see here, Morrison began defensively. No, you see here. Garrett's tone was respectful but unyielding. That woman saved my parents' lives. She's cared for the sick in this community without compensation or recognition. Yet when she needed help after her husband died, this town turned its back. When she took in my parents, this church questioned her morality. The pastor had the grace to look uncomfortable. Perhaps there were misunderstandings. Then it's time to correct them. Garrett placed an envelope on the desk. This is a donation for the church, a substantial one. I'd like it used to establish a fund for widows and others in need, and I'd like Sarah Winters to help administer it. Morrison stared at the envelope, then at Garrett. That's highly irregular. So is a church that preaches charity but practices judgment, Garrett interrupted. Consider this an opportunity for reconciliation, Pastor, for the church and for the town. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. When my father is well enough to travel, I'd like you to come to Ridge Creek to offer communion, yes, but more importantly, to offer a genuine apology to Mrs. Winters. Can I count on you for that? Faced with both the sizable donation and Garrett's direct challenge, Pastor Morrison could only nod his agreement. Garrett returned to the cabin the following afternoon, his saddlebags laden with the gifts he'd purchased and news of Blackwood's detention. He found the household in an unexpected state of activity. Daniel, against all medical advice, was seated in a chair by the fire, directing Clara and Sarah as they rearranged furniture in the newly completed addition. The table should face the window, Daniel insisted. A man likes to see the sky while he eats. The morning sun will be in our eyes, Clara countered. The table belongs along the wall. Sarah noticed Garrett in the doorway and gave him a look that clearly said, See what I've been dealing with? You're supposed to be in bed, Garrett said to his father, dismounting and securing his horse. Daniel waved dismissively. Been in that bed so long, I was starting to take root. Besides, a man needs to oversee his home's arrangement. His home? Garrett raised an eyebrow at Sarah. Apparently, we're all just living in Daniel Sullivan's domain now, she replied dryly, despite whose name is on the deed. Despite her sarcastic tone, Garrett detected a note of affection in her voice. In the short time they'd been together, a bond had formed between Sarah and his parents, particularly Daniel. Their shared experiences of war, loss, and survival had created a connection that transcended their different backgrounds. How was town? Sarah asked as she helped him unload his saddlebags. Productive. Garrett summarized the hearing in Blackwood's outburst. He'll stand trial within 2 months. Good, Bassan, Daniel called from his chair. Always said that man had a dishonest look about him. Clara smiled indulgently at her husband. You say that about every banker, dear. And I'm usually right. Sarah led Garrett to the kitchen area away from his parents' bickering. And the other matters? Your ranch? Your business affairs? All arranged. Garrett unpacked the supplies he'd brought. My foreman will manage the ranch operations. The bank has a new acting manager with strict oversight from a board I trust. Sarah watched him, her gray eyes searching. How long do you intend to stay here, Garrett? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond its simple phrasing. As long as I'm needed, he answered carefully. My father still has a long recovery ahead, and there's the matter of rebuilding their home. They could go to your ranch, Sarah pointed out. You have space, servants, comfort. They could, Garrett agreed, but they won't. This is where they want to be. With me? Skepticism colored her voice. Or with you? Both, I think. Garrett met her gaze directly. And I want to be here too, Sarah, not just for them. A flush of color touched her cheeks, and she turned away, busying herself with organizing the supplies. You've brought half of Mrs. Chen's store, she observed, changing the subject. These things are too fine, too expensive. They're gifts, Garrett said simply, for the home you've shared with us. I don't need, gifts aren't about need, he interrupted gently. They're about appreciation, about connection. Sarah's hands stilled on the colorful quilt he'd brought. Her fingers traced the intricate pattern, lingering on the rich fabric. It's beautiful, she admitted softly. Like this place, Garrett said. Like the life you've built here against all odds. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a momentary lowering of the walls she'd built so carefully around herself. Then she folded the quilt and set it aside. Your father should return to bed before he exhausts himself, she said, professional efficiency replacing vulnerability. And you must be tired from your journey. Garrett accepted the return to practicalities, understanding that Sarah needed time. The river Mrs. Chen had spoken of was still finding its course, wearing down resistance gradually rather than all at once. April arrived with the first real signs of spring. The snow retreated to shadowed hollows and north-facing slopes, leaving the rest of the land muddy but increasingly green. Daniel's strength returned steadily, allowing him short walks outside on fair days. Garrett continued his improvements to the cabin and surrounding property, building a proper barn to replace the lean-to and preparing a large garden plot for Sarah. On a particularly mild morning, Garrett found Sarah at the edge of the newly turned garden, studying the soil with a critical eye. "Will it do?" he asked, joining her. "The soil's good," she acknowledged. "Better drainage than my old plot behind the cabin. We should get a fine yield if the weather holds." Garrett noted, pleased by her use of the word. Sarah glanced at him, then back at the garden. "Well, I assume you'll be here for the planting at least. Whether you stay for the harvest remains to be seen." "I told you I'm not leaving." "Men say many things, Garrett." Her voice held no accusation, just a simple statement of her experience. "Time will tell which promises hold." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Coming up the trail were two riders, Pastor Morrison and another man Garrett didn't recognize. "Were you expecting visitors?" Sarah asked, tension evident in her posture. "Just the pastor. I asked him to come when my father was stronger." Garrett touched her arm reassuringly. "It's all right, Sarah. This is a peace offering, not a confrontation." She didn't appear convinced, but accompanied him to meet the arrivals. Pastor Morrison dismounted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable on horseback. His companion, a younger man with kind eyes and a medical bag, dismounted with more grace. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Winters," the pastor greeted them. "May I present Dr. Matthew Lawrence? He's newly arrived in Cedar Valley to establish a practice." "Doctor?" Garrett shook the man's hand. "We're grateful for your visit. My father has been improving, but another medical opinion would be welcome." "Happy to help," Dr. Lawrence replied, his voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "Pastor Morrison mentioned the heart condition. I've had some success with similar cases in Boston." Sarah regarded the newcomer with professional interest. "You're a long way from Boston, doctor." "I wanted to practice where I was truly needed," Lawrence explained. "Frontier communities often lack proper medical care." "A noble sentiment," Sarah said, though her tone suggested skepticism about how long such nobility might last in the harsh realities of Wyoming. They led the visitors inside, where Daniel greeted the pastor with gruff courtesy and submitted to Dr. Lawrence's examination with surprising cooperation. While the doctor worked, Pastor Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Winters," he began, "I've come to offer the church's, that is, my personal," he faltered, then started again more directly. "I've come to apologize for our treatment of you, both after Mr. Winters' passing and more recently regarding the Sullivan stay here." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Have you now?" "Yes." Morrison twisted his hat in his hands. "Our Lord teaches compassion and charity, yet I failed to demonstrate either. Instead of supporting a widow in need, I allowed town gossip and propriety to dictate my actions. It was unchristian of me." "It was human of you, Pastor," Sarah replied, her voice softer than Garrett expected. "We all fall short of our highest principles at times. Nevertheless, I ask your forgiveness." Morrison looked genuinely contrite. "And I bring news. The church has established a fund for those in need, widows, orphans, the ill. We would be honored if you would help administer it, given your experience with the community's medical needs." Sarah glanced at Garrett, understanding immediately his role in this development. "That's a generous offer, Pastor. I'll consider it." From the bedroom, Dr. Lawrence emerged, looking pleased. "Mr. Sullivan's recovery is remarkable," he announced. "The heart is stronger than I expected, though he'll need continued rest and careful monitoring." "Thanks to Sarah's care," Clara said proudly, "she's been extraordinary." "Indeed." Lawrence turned to Sarah with professional respect. "Your nursing skills are evident, Mrs. Winters. The surgical scar on his side, That's from a battlefield procedure, isn't it? Gettysburg, Sarah confirmed, though it was a long time ago. The stitching is expert work. You were trained as a nurse? As a doctor's daughter, she corrected. My father believed women should understand medicine, even if society didn't allow them to practice it officially. Lawrence's expression brightened with interest. A progressive thinker. I share that philosophy. In fact, I've been hoping to find a qualified assistant for my new practice, someone with experience treating frontier ailments as well as standard medical conditions. Sarah stared at him, clearly caught off guard. Are you offering me a position, doctor? I am, Lawrence spoke earnestly. Cedar Valley needs more medical care than one doctor can provide. Your knowledge of local remedies, combined with my formal training, could serve the community well. The proposition hung in the air, unexpected and transformative. Garrett watched Sarah's face, seeing the professional recognition she'd long been denied suddenly within reach. It's a generous offer, she said carefully, but I have responsibilities here. The garden to plant, Mr. Sullivan's continued recovery. We would manage, Claire interrupted gently. Your skills are too valuable to be limited to one family, Sarah. Think about it, Lawrence suggested. The position would be part-time initially, perhaps 2 days a week in town, with emergency calls as needed. After the visitors departed, promising to return the following week, an unusual quiet settled over the cabin. Daniel had retired to rest after the examination, and Clara busied herself with mending, leaving Sarah and Garrett alone by the fire. You're considering it, Garrett observed, watching Sarah's pensive expression. It would be foolish not to, she admitted. Proper medical work, official recognition of my skills. She shook her head slightly. Things I never thought possible here. You deserve it, Garrett said sincerely. Your abilities have been overlooked too long. Sarah studied him. This was your doing, wasn't it? The pastor's apology, the church fund, perhaps even the new doctor. I may have encouraged the pastor's change of heart, Garrett acknowledged, but Dr. Lawrence sought you out on his own merit. Your reputation as a healer is more widespread than you realize. And what of your parents? Your promise to stay and help them rebuild? That hasn't changed, Garrett leaned forward. Sarah, don't you see this is an opportunity for both of us to build something meaningful here. My parents' new home, your medical practice, a community that values contribution over appearance. And us, she asked quietly, what would we be building, Garrett? The question struck at the heart of what had remained unspoken between them. The growing connection, the possibility of something more than temporary arrangement. Whatever we choose, he answered honestly. I can only tell you what I want, Sarah. A life that matters. Work that serves others rather than just myself, and someone to share it with who understands both the person I was and the man I'm trying to become. Sarah looked into the fire, silent for a long moment. I've been alone a long time, she said finally. Built walls to protect myself after Thomas died. It's not easy to imagine life another way. I know. Garrett resisted the urge to touch her hand. I built different walls. Wealth, distance, constant movement. They protected me from feeling the loss of Elizabeth and our child. And now I'm learning that protection can become a prison. He smiled slightly. A wise woman once told me that stillness isn't weakness, it's where healing starts. The ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. Sounds like someone who talks too much. Sounds like someone who changed my life. The following Sunday, at Daniel's insistence, they attended services at the Cedar Valley Church. It was the first time Sarah had entered the building since Thomas's funeral, and her apprehension was palpable as they approached. We don't have to do this, Garrett murmured as he helped her down from the wagon. Yes, we do, she replied firmly. Some ghosts need facing in daylight. Their entrance caused a predictable stir. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned, whispers rippled through the congregation. Then Mrs. Chen, sitting in the third row, stood and deliberately crossed to Sarah, taking her hand warmly. Mrs. Winters, so good to see you in church again. Her voice carried clearly in the hushed sanctuary. Please join our family. We save places. One by one, other townspeople followed Mrs. Chen's example. The blacksmith's wife who remembered how Sarah had set her son's broken arm. The school teacher whose pneumonia Sarah had treated the previous winter. Even old Mrs. Hollister, the judge's mother, who credited Sarah with saving her eyesight with a special herbal compress. By the time Pastor Morrison arrived to begin the service, Sarah was seated among the congregation, surrounded by people whose lives she had touched. Her initial isolation transformed into belonging. During his sermon, the pastor spoke of redemption and community, of the need for forgiveness and second chances. Though he never mentioned Sarah directly, his meaning was clear to everyone present. Today marks a new beginning for our church, he concluded, a return to the principles of compassion and service that should guide all Christian communities. Let us go forward together, supporting one another in times of need, celebrating together in times of joy. After the service, Dr. Lawrence approached Sarah on the church steps, confirming arrangements for her to begin working at his clinic the following Wednesday. Daniel, leaning on his walking stick but prouder than Garrett had seen him in years, made a point of introducing Sarah to everyone as the woman who saved my life. Twice. The next morning, Garrett found a moment alone with Dr. Lawrence before the physician departed. "Doctor, about my father's heart condition. Is it a result of the fire or something more?" Dr. Lawrence considered the question carefully. "Both, I would say. Your father has an old injury, shrapnel embedded near his heart from the war. Sarah mentioned it was from Gettysburg." "Yes, she apparently treated him there," Garrett confirmed. "Well, that wound never fully healed internally," Lawrence explained. "Most men wouldn't have survived it at all, but your father is remarkably resilient. However, the smoke inhalation and stress from the fire put tremendous strain on his already compromised heart. The cold night in the barn afterward likely exacerbated the condition." Garrett's face darkened. "So Blackwood's actions could have killed him even if the fire hadn't." "Quite possibly," Lawrence nodded gravely. "The body remembers old wounds, Mr. Sullivan. Sometimes they lie dormant for years until a new trauma awakens them." He packed his medical bag. "Your father needs consistent care now. The damage can't be undone, but with proper treatment, he could have many good years ahead." As the doctor mounted his horse, he added, "You're fortunate Mrs. Winters recognized the symptoms. Few would have connected his collapse to an old war wound. She has remarkable medical intuition." The information settled heavily on Garrett. His father's condition was more complicated than he'd realized, a combination of past sacrifice and present treachery. The war that had divided them continued to exact its price, even decades later. The drive back to Ridge Creek was peaceful, the spring afternoon filled with bird song and the scent of new growth. Daniel and Clara dozed in the back of the wagon, tired from the excursion, but visibly contented. "It went better than you expected," Garrett observed, keeping his voice low to avoid waking his parents. "It did," Sarah admitted, "though I'm still not entirely convinced it will last." "People can change, Sarah, communities too. Perhaps," she looked out at the greening landscape, "or perhaps they simply needed permission to be their better selves." "Is that what I needed?" Garrett asked, thinking of his own transformation. "Permission?" Sarah considered this. "No, you needed stillness, the chance to stop running long enough to remember who you truly are." The simple truth of her words touched him deeply. They drove in comfortable silence until they reached the final ridge overlooking the cabin. Garrett halted the wagon, taking in the scene below. The expanded cabin with its new addition, the garden plot ready for planting, the small barn he'd built. What had been a lonely widow's struggle for survival had become something else entirely. Something with a future. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about my parents' homestead." "They'll need a new house," Sarah agreed, "once Daniel is fully recovered." "Yes, but I'm not sure the old location is right anymore. The memories there are complicated now, after the fire, after everything that's happened." Sarah studied him. "What are you suggesting?" Garrett gestured toward the open land extending from Sarah's property. "That field to the west of your cabin. It's part of your 100 acres, isn't it?" "It is. It would make a fine building site, close enough for family to support each other, but with enough distance for privacy." Madame, he hesitated, then added, "If you'd consider it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, gazing at the land in question. "I've never thought of sharing my land before," she said finally. "It's been my one security in an uncertain world." "I understand." Garrett nodded, careful not to press. "It was just a thought." "A good one," she surprised him by saying. "Your parents would be close enough for me to monitor Daniel's health, And the land is fertile but unplanted, a shame to waste it. Hope rose in Garrett's chest. Then you'll consider it? I'll more than consider it. Sarah's eyes met his. I think it's the right solution for all of us. The all of us lingered between them, its meaning expanding beyond his parents to include something still forming, still finding its shape. The following Wednesday, Garrett drove Sarah to town for her first day at Dr. Lawrence's clinic. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Clara had helped modify for professional appearance, and carried a small medical bag containing herbs and remedies the doctor had asked her to bring. Nervous? Garrett asked as they approached the town. No, Sarah replied automatically, then smiled slightly. Yes, it's been a long time since I practiced proper medicine, not just frontier remedies and common sense. There's something I didn't tell you before, Sarah admitted, her eyes focused on the fire. About the night of the fire. Garrett looked up from his work. What do you mean? I wasn't just passing by, as Jennings told you. She folded her hands in her lap. 3 days before the fire, I was gathering herbs on the ridge overlooking your parents' property. I saw a man in a fine suit arguing with your father by the well. Your father was angry, shouting about not selling, no matter the price. Blackwood, Garrett said grimly. Sarah nodded. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. The man threatened your father before leaving. Said something about regretting this decision. I didn't like it. Her expression hardened. I know what desperate men are capable of, so I made a point to circle by your parents' homestead each evening after that. When I saw the flames that night, I was already on my way there. You suspected arson, Garrett realized. I suspected a man in a fine suit who was used to getting his way. Sarah's eyes met his. I just didn't know he worked for you. You'll be magnificent, Garrett assured her. Your knowledge runs deeper than you give yourself credit for. The clinic was a modest building near the town square, freshly painted with Dr. Matthew Lawrence, physician and surgeon, on a new sign above the door. Inside, the doctor had created a surprisingly well-equipped facility with a waiting room, examination area, and small surgical theater. Mrs. Winters, Lawrence greeted them warmly. Right on time. We already have 3 patients waiting, including Mrs. Hollister for her eye examination. Sarah's professional demeanor took over immediately. She bid Garrett a brief goodbye, arranged to meet him at midday, and turned her full attention to the work at hand. Garrett spent the morning at the bank, continuing the reforms he'd begun after Blackwood's arrest. He met with farmers who'd faced foreclosure, arranging more favorable terms and, in some cases, outright forgiveness of impossible debts. The work was satisfying in a way his previous business endeavors had never been, building community rather than just personal wealth. At noon, he stopped by the clinic to find it still busy with patients. Sarah moved efficiently between rooms, her earlier nervousness replaced by confident expertise. She spotted him in the doorway and approached, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work. We're running behind, she explained. Doctor, Lawrence asked if I could stay through the afternoon. There's been a steady stream of patients since we opened, many women who've been putting off treatment because they were uncomfortable with a male physician. Of course, Garrett agreed readily. I'll meet you at the Hollisters for dinner as planned. Yes, though I may be a bit late. She hesitated, then surprised him by briefly squeezing his hand. Thank you, Garrett, for everything. The simple gesture and words carried more weight than 1,000 elaborate declarations might have. As Garrett watched her return to her patients, he felt a certainty settling in his chest, a vision of a future taking shape, day by day, choice by choice. That evening, Judge Hollister's dinner table became the setting for an unexpected announcement. The Territorial Circuit Court was establishing a permanent presence in Cedar Valley, and the judge needed a legal advisor with knowledge of both banking regulations and land law. Your handling of this Blackwood situation showed good judgment, Sullivan, Hollister said over dessert, and your banking experience would be invaluable as we establish proper legal framework for the territory's growth. I'm not a lawyer, Judge, Garrett pointed out. Don't need a full lawyer, Hollister replied. Need a man who understands the practical application of law in banking and land disputes. 3 days a week advising the court and reviewing cases. Rest of your time remains your own. Sarah, seated beside Garrett, watched him carefully. It sounds like important work, she observed. It is, Hollister confirmed. As Wyoming moves towards statehood, We need men of integrity helping shape our legal system. Men who understand both progress and justice aren't always the same thing. Garrett considered the offer, aware of its symmetry with Sarah's new position at the clinic. Both of them using their skills to serve the community, building something meaningful together. I'd be honored to accept, Judge, he said finally. Though I should mention I'm planning to help rebuild my parents' home as well. On my land, Sarah added quietly, drawing surprised looks from the others at the table. Near Ridge Creek. Mrs. Hollister, a perceptive woman with a romantic streak, smiled broadly. How wonderful. The two of you working in town part-time, building a homestead together. Almost like a partnership, Sarah supplied before the older woman could say something more presumptuous. A practical arrangement benefiting all involved. Practical indeed, Mrs. Hollister agreed, though her knowing smile remained. Later, as Garrett drove Sarah home beneath a canopy of stars, the conversation turned to their newly aligned futures. Judge Hollister seemed pleased with your acceptance, Sarah observed, though his wife seemed to read more into our arrangement than currently exists. Garrett smiled at her diplomatic phrasing. Currently exists, he repeated. That suggests the possibility of change. All things change with time, Sarah replied, though her tone had softened. Rivers find new courses, seasons turn, and people find each other, Garrett added quietly. Sometimes when they least expect it. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness of the wagon seat. Sometimes, she agreed. By early May, the foundation for Daniel and Clara's new home was laid on the western field. Garrett had designed a comfortable one-story dwelling that would accommodate Daniel's need for accessibility as he aged, with wide doorways, a covered porch wrapping around three sides, and large windows to catch both morning and evening light. Sarah's garden flourished under the combined care of the entire household. Clara's knowledge of traditional farming merged with Sarah's expertise in medicinal herbs, creating a productive plot that promised both food and healing. Daniel, though still limited in his physical capabilities, contributed by fashioning trellises and plant supports from willow branches, his skilled hands finding purpose in creation rather than destruction. On a perfect spring morning, with the meadows erupting in wildflowers and the distant mountains still capped with snow, Garrett found Sarah at the small cemetery where Thomas's grave stood. She knelt beside the weathered stone, not in mourning but in something that looked like peaceful remembrance, placing a small bouquet of early blooms at its base. Garrett hesitated, reluctant to intrude on this private moment, but Sarah looked up and saw him. It's all right, she said softly. Come join me. He approached and stood beside her, hat in hand out of respect. I can come back later if you'd prefer to be alone. No, Sarah rose, brushing soil from her skirt. I've said what I needed to say. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, looking at the simple grave marker. Then Sarah spoke, her voice thoughtful. I used to come here every day, especially that first year, talking to him, asking for guidance, wondering how I would survive without him. She sighed. Then it became once a week, then once a month. Not because I loved him less, but because I was learning to live again. That's as it should be, Garrett said. The dead don't want us to stop living. No, they don't. Sarah turned to face him fully. I've realized something, Garrett, something important. What's that? Gratitude can keep us connected to those we have lost without keeping us chained to grief. She glanced back at the grave. I'm grateful for every day I had with Thomas, for all he taught me about love and resilience. But that gratitude doesn't mean I can't find new joy, new purpose. Garrett felt his heart quicken at her words, understanding their significance. Sarah, let me finish, she said gently. When you first came to my door that winter night, I saw only a wealthy man who'd neglected his family, who thought money could solve everything. I judged you as harshly as this town once judged me. You had reason to, Garrett acknowledged. Perhaps, but I failed to see the man beneath those surface judgments, the man who would learn to split wood until his hands bled, who would rebuild a stranger's home without complaint, who would use his influence to create opportunities for others rather than just for himself. She took a step closer to him. I've been afraid, Garrett, afraid to trust, to risk, to open my heart again. But I'm tired of fear dictating my choices. Hope bloomed in Garrett's chest, bright and powerful. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying that I think it's time for both of us to stop living half-lives." Her gray eyes held his steadily. "To stop letting the past determine our future." Garrett reached for her hands, enfolding them in his own. "I love you, Sarah Winters," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since you commanded me to eat your stew that first night." A smile touched her lips, genuine and unguarded. "I was rather imperious, wasn't I?" "You were magnificent," he corrected. "Strong and principled and uncompromising. Everything I wasn't but needed to become." "You give me too much credit. You always had those qualities within you, Garrett. They were just buried beneath grief and guilt. As your capacity for joy was buried beneath loss and survival." He lifted one hand to gently touch her cheek. "We found each other at exactly the right moment, I think." "When we both needed healing," Sarah agreed, "when stillness finally became possible." The breeze rustled through the pines surrounding the small cemetery, carrying the scent of spring growth and possibility. In the distance, they could see the cabin and the new foundation taking shape nearby, physical manifestations of the future they were building. "Sarah Winters," Garrett said, his voice steady with certainty, "will you marry me? Not because you need me or I need you, but because together we're better than we are apart." Sarah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." Their kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a passion, the beginning of something built on solid ground rather than desperate need. As they walked hand in hand back toward the cabin, where Daniel and Clara waited on the porch, Daniel whittling what looked suspiciously like a baby's cradle, Clara knitting a blanket too small for an adult, Garrett felt a peace he'd never known before. The flame that had started in the depths of winter's frost had transformed into something sustainable, enduring. Not the consuming fire of ambition that had driven him for so long, nor the desperate blaze of grief that had followed Elizabeth's death. This was a steady warmth, the kind that could sustain a family through Wyoming's harshest winters and brightest summers. "We should tell Mom," Sarah said as they approached, nodding toward his parents. "I think they already know," Garrett replied, noting his father's knowing smile and his mother's barely contained excitement. "But yes, we'll make it official." As they climbed the porch steps together, Daniel held up his carving, indeed a perfect miniature cradle, exquisitely detailed. "For the future," he said, eyes twinkling. "Whenever it arrives." Clara elbowed him gently. "Daniel Sullivan, don't embarrass them." "Not embarrassed," Sarah surprised them all by saying. "Hopeful, for all our futures, together." The rocking chair that had waited so long, the one that had stood empty by the fire on that first snowy night, now held Clara, contentedly working on her knitting. But Garrett knew another chair would soon join it on the porch of their expanded home. Two chairs, side by side, watching the seasons change, bearing witness to the life they would build together. A family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and sacrifice and love that bloomed in the hardest soil. Home at last. Their wedding took place on a perfect June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the meadow between the cabins. The entire population of Cedar Valley seemed to attend, spreading picnic blankets across the grass, bringing dishes and gifts in genuine good wishes. Pastor Morrison performed the ceremony beneath an arch of twisted willow branches that Daniel had crafted, his voice carrying across the valley as he spoke of second chances and the courage to begin anew. Sarah wore a simple dress of ivory linen with sprigs of lavender tucked into her hair. Garrett couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Daniel's arm, his father, steady now, proudly escorting the woman who had saved his life twice. In the front row, Clara dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly, her shrewd eyes taking in the transformation of both the land and its people. News had reached them the previous day that Hiram Blackwood had been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison. Justice had been served, though Garrett found the news brought him more relief than satisfaction. The man's actions had, in their way, led him back to this place, to these people, to himself. By August, Daniel and Clara's new house stood complete, a comfortable dwelling with wide porches and ample windows. Close enough for daily visits, but separate enough for privacy, a perfect balance. Daniel had insisted on doing much of the finish work himself, his hands steady again as he carved decorative elements into door frames and window casings. The house sat positioned to catch both the sunrise and sunset, as if claiming all hours of the day for living fully. Lawrence had expanded his practice to include a small hospital wing, with Sarah serving as head nurse 3 days a week. Her reputation had grown beyond Cedar Valley, with people traveling from neighboring settlements to benefit from her knowledge of both traditional medicine and frontier remedies. On her off days, she tended her expanded garden, preserving herbs and teaching Clara the medicinal properties of each plant. As autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, Sarah and Garrett sat on their porch in the gathering dusk, watching Daniel demonstrate wood-carving techniques to a small group of children from town. Among them was Wei Chun, showing remarkable aptitude under Daniel's patient instruction. "He's found his purpose," Sarah observed, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen. "Teaching the next generation." Garrett covered her hand with his, still marveling at the miracle growing beneath their joined fingers. "As we all have." Clara emerged from the cabin carrying a tray with cups of hot cider. As she distributed them, she paused to straighten a third rocking chair that sat between the two larger ones. A small chair, perfectly scaled for a child, that Daniel had completed the previous week, his eyes twinkling as he presented it to them. "For the newest Sullivan," he had said, "when they're ready." As darkness settled over the valley, the family gathered around the fire pit Daniel had built between the two houses. Stories were shared, plans made, laughter echoing across the land that had witnessed so much pain and now cradled so much joy. The flame that had begun in winter's deepest frost had become a steady hearth fire, warming generations past and future. In the dance of the flames, Garrett could almost see the faces of those who had brought them to this moment. Elizabeth, Thomas, Catherine, not as ghosts to be feared, but as gentle guardians, blessing the life that continued. Home was no longer a place to flee from or return to. It was something they created anew each day, with every choice, every act of forgiveness, every moment of presence. It was, quite simply, here.